So we're in your government book. We're in chapter 6. We're in section 3 now. And this section is going to focus on the roles of the president. So what role does the president play in our government? So the president's position of leadership is an unusual one in the modern world. Most countries separate the roles of the head of state from the head of government. Like you take an example was be Great Britain. Great Britain has a queen that's basically the head of state, the dignitary, and then the Great Britain also has a prime minister, and the prime minister actually runs, is basically the head of the government and runs the government. So, and that's what a lot of countries have. They have a head of state and a head of government. So that is important to know. But in the United States, what do we have? We don't have a monarch that sits on a throne, do we? But we have a president that is head of state, but also is the head of our government, both. So in the United States, the president must do both. The president of the United States has 5 primary roles. What are these roles? You need to know them. First of all, they're chief of state, and that's that head of state like a queen or a king would have. They're chief of state as a dignitary. Number 2, they're chief executive, carrying out the law, right? The chief executive position, head of the government. So right there we have chief of state and chief of executive. Chief of state would be kind of like that role of a king or queen, and chief executive would be that role like prime minister going together. So those two right there on top. But they also are the chief legislator, the chief lawmaker, making sure the laws are carried out. And we'll find out more about that. And they're a chief diplomat in that point, diplomat being foreign affairs, dealing with foreign countries. And of course, last and most importantly, they are the commander-in-chief, the commander of our armed services, our commander-in-chief. So we're going to go through each one of these 5 groups in this video. So let's start with the chief of state. The chief of state is that ceremonial head, like that king or queen, in a sense. So we would never say, oh, king or queen of that for sure, because the president was, even the name president was taken as a lesser role. Of course, our forefathers didn't want a powerful figure in the head of our chief of our state. But as the president comes, he is the ceremonial head of our government, and he is a symbol of our national unity, and he stands as a symbol of our Constitution. His duties, what are his duties? His duties, let's go on to the next page here to express it better. There's a picture of George Washington as being that inaugurated as a chief of state. But his duties basically are in the position as the chief of state, as a dignitary. His duties would be like things like dedicating monuments and parks and post offices, or decorating war heroes, maybe throwing the first ball out at the baseball season, starting the baseball season. A lot of presidents are doing that as a dignitary. Official state visits to foreign countries, visiting foreign countries, that's a dignified chief of state. And receiving and visiting chiefs of state at the White House. So these are duties as chief of state. Let's go back here. Maybe I didn't. Chief, those are the president makes official state visits to foreign countries and receives visiting chiefs of state at the White House. These are all have to do with chief of state. So first of all, the chief of state is the president is the ceremonial head of the government. So, and a symbol of national unity. So you just make sure you have that. So going on, there are actually 3 different areas here that they're going to talk about. How the United States, in the United States, our president has these ceremonial functions as chief of state. There's three main ones. Of course, the war heroes, decorating war heroes and dedicating monuments and throwing the first ball out the World Series and those kind of things. Yeah, they are important. But the three things that you need to know that are important, and we have, first of all, is the inauguration ceremony. We're going to talk about the inauguration ceremony. The second thing is going to be the State of the Union address. Each president has to have an inauguration, and then they have to have the state of address, and the last would be the reception of ambassadors and heads in those ceremonies that go along with other countries receiving dignitaries from other countries. So three areas that we're going to be talking about. One is inauguration, and we're going to talk about that, and the next would be the State of the Union, and the next would be receiving dignitaries. These are all to do with the president as chief of state. So what about this inauguration ceremony? Well, it happens. The inauguration ceremony happens every 4 years, because every 4 years we vote for president, don't we? So 2 months after our vote in November, or the November elections in January, and it's set forth by the 20th Amendment in 1933, said that the inauguration would be on January at noon on January 20th instead of March 1st. Well, the reason they had to set forth this 20th Amendment is in 1933, because before that they had what was called the lame duck. It took a long time for transportation and for the president to get situated, so they gave the president until March. But during that time between November and March, a different president was there, and he was kind of like a lame duck. He couldn't do hardly anything because another president had already been voted on, or had taken his place, or in that situation, a lame duck, even the lame duck Congress when we talk about senators and such. But anyway, so they set forth the 20th Amendment. The inauguration is to take place at noon on January 20th of every year now since 1933, because of the 20th Amendment of the Constitution. So an oath is recited. This oath here, as you see, it says, "I do solemnly swear or affirm that I will faithfully execute the office of the President of the United States, and will to the best of my ability preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States." So here's a picture of George Washington being inaugurated, one of the most famous inaugurations there. So the administration is now by the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court. And basically that swearing is on a Bible, right? To preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. So basically the president is to stand for the Constitution. Here's a picture of George Washington. But George Washington was on a balcony. See him on the balcony there? Federal Hall in New York City. New York City was our first capital before Washington D.C. was even built. And so George Washington stood on the Federal Hall in New York City, and on his hand on his Bible there, and gave his inaugural ceremony, his inaugural address. Thomas Jefferson, though, he was the third president. He received his inauguration in Washington, D.C., but not on the Capitol building, as the Capitol building wasn't quite built. James Madison, the fourth president, actually was the first president to receive his inauguration on the steps of the Capitol building. And now all the presidents that since James Madison, they receive their inaugural address, their inaugural ceremony, where they're sworn into being our president on the steps of the Capitol. And that's the traditional place. See George Washington there on April 30th, 1789, with his hand on his Bible. Chancellor Livingston of New York administered an oath, and Washington at the end of the oath said, "So help me God." Now everyone at the end of their oath, they say, "So help me God," with their Bible. So, and then afterwards, sometimes the presidents give a short inaugural address after the ceremony, and just put forth some main points maybe in becoming president. So, but nations, we know, even as the time of George Washington, need to know that the president is actually putting his continual dependence on God in the midst of inaugural address. So it says, after taking the oath, the president gives a short inaugural address, which is a speech usually expressing the main points to be followed by his administration. So, and that one of the things is that continuous dependence on God. President George Washington stressed this dependence in his first inaugural address. Let's go over this here. George Washington. I think it's important in history that you know what George Washington, as he set the precedent of this, what he said, right? So let's read what George Washington said here. It would be peculiarly improper to omit in this first official act my fervent supplication to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations. In tendering this homage to the great author of every public and private good, I assure myself that it expresses your sentiments not less than my own. I shall take my present leave, but not without resorting once more to the benign parent of the human race, in humble supplication that since he has been pleased to favor the American people with opportunities, so his divine blessing may be equally conspicuous in the enlarged views, the temperate consolations, and the wise measures on which the success of the government must depend. This whole thing, everything he said here, has to do with what? Has to do with God. You see the words, my fervent supplication to that Almighty Being who rules over the universe, presides over the councils of nations, that great author of every public and private good, going on to that benign parent of the human race, and humble supplication to him, and on to that divine blessing that God gives us, and on to the last part that says that God gives wise measures on which the success of the government must depend. So you can see how George Washington was really dependent on God. And we hope that a president that takes that position with the Bible in his hand will be the same. So, number one, we're talking about, what are we talking about again? We're talking about the chief of state, and we're talking about the the ceremonies, the dignified ceremonies. And the first one was the inauguration. The second one is going to be the State of the Union address. So what's the difference? Well, the State of the Union address happens shortly after Congress convenes in January to the new session. Then the president gives the annual State of the Union to Congress. So he's talking to Congress, although it's very televised and everyone is very interested in the State of the Union address. Why are they interested in the State of the Union address? Because the State of the Union address, the president's going to state how the Union is and what he's going to do. What he's going to do in his next 4-year term. So after the Congress convenes in January, the annual State of the Union address is to Congress, and the senators and representatives in the House, they gather in a joint session, and the president reports on the condition of the nation and summarizes his domestic and foreign issues. Basically where he's going to focus. Where is the president going to focus? And what kind of legislation or what kind of bills are the president going to promote in Congress? He's going to recommend certain legislation through Congress to the Senate and to the House of Representatives. So that's basically what the State of the Union is basically telling what the State of the Union is going to be about. So President Washington and President Adams delivered their State of the Union address in person, to Congress, and everyone, stood, especially President Washington and President Adams too. But President Thomas Jefferson, you wouldn't think that he was more introverted, so he just sent a written message to Congress, to the legislator, and had somebody read it out loud. And so that kind of got a precedent for a while until Woodrow Wilson, who was 28. So from the third president, which is Thomas Jefferson, clear to the 28th president, which was President Woodrow Wilson, the president just basically sent a written message and had somebody read it. They didn't read it to Congress, they had somebody read it for them. But now, since Woodrow Wilson, each president now presents their State of the Union address in person. And now it's on radio and it's on TV. It's been on radio for quite a while. It's on TV, it's on the internet, and the world can see and how important the State of the Union address is now. So it basically is an outline of the president's budget too. So not only that, people can look at, okay, where's the money going to go in the midst of our government? And that budget is submitted after the speech. So State of the Union, very important. The third dignitary address, remember, first of all, we have inauguration. Now we have State of the Union. Number 3 is when the president receives dignitaries. And so here's a picture of President Bush and Queen Elizabeth, and he's honoring the Queen at the White House in a ceremony. So receiving dignitaries are a Constitution duty. The Constitution says that the president will receive dignitaries, and that means ambassadors and ministers. It names them in the Constitution. And so there's a protocol to this. So there's the collections of ceremonies and behaviors that the president needs to know about when he's, in fact, as for receiving the Queen of England, so the Queen of England and the Prime Minister, the Queen is the head of the state, and the Prime Minister is the head of the government. So the President of the United States greets the Queen first, and then the Vice President actually greets the Prime Minister, the Prime Minister being under the Queen. And so it's very important that presidents need to know all of these important things when they're dealing with dignitaries. So that whole section is section 1 and has to do with the Chief of State. So he also now is not just the Chief of State, but he also is, let's go back up here in this section here, and you can see some of these presidents that were inaugurated, and they used certain Bibles and certain scriptures to be inaugurated. And you can go over these. Micah 6:8 is important, and Isaiah 2:4, Isaiah 58. So a lot of times certain presidents would have to have their Bible opened to certain scriptures when they get inaugurated. I love about Ronald Reagan. He's one of all of these guys. I'm not really fond of most of them, but Ronald Reagan I am. When I say fond of most of them, there's couple of them. I'm not a big Clinton supporter or a Warren G. Harding supporter, those two. And Jimmy Carter, he was a good guy, but not the best of presidents. But Ronald Reagan, he had his mother's Bible open to 2 Chronicles 7:14. You can look up 2 Chronicles 7:14. If my people who are called by me will humble themselves and pray, turn from their wicked ways, that is that scripture that God will show up in the midst. So 2 Chronicles 7:14, and that's what Ronald Reagan. So let's go on. This is so sweet on what American presidents have said about the Bible, but I'm going to skip that and do that in another video at the end, because I want to read some of those, and it'll get pretty long. Let's go into the chief executive. So we already know he's the head of the state in all the ceremonies and such, but he's also the chief executive. So the chief executive gives what's called ordinance power. So what is ordinance power? Ordinance power is power to see that the laws of the federal government are carried out and enforced. So it's enforcing the power to enforce the laws. The Constitution says that the president has to the ordinance power has to be faithfully executed. In that they call it basically the executive branch of the government in doing this. So he's the chief executive. The president may issue an executive order. So what's an executive order? Executive order is a command of the president without the Congress's approval, so having the force of law. So if they say that there's an executive order, it just is an order by the president without the Congress having to approve it. So an ordinance power would be an executive order. So it's very rare that the president may call out the military to see that federal law is properly enforced, and this would be an executive order. But it's kind of rare, but it's happened. This happened a few cases. Well, one of the case examples here is with President Eisenhower. So the Brown versus the Board of Education, I don't know if you know about that, in 1954, that basically said that the schools will not be segregated. And so basically when these young African American students went to school, they needed protection. So President Eisenhower, knowing that they would fight this in Arkansas, in Little Rock, Arkansas, set in basically ordinance power, an executive order of calling in the national federal troops to guard the public school, so that basically at the public school it would be desegregated, and that black African American children would be allowed to go to school there. But he called out the guard in Little Rock to prevent a riot from happening there, or suspecting that it might happen. So that's one case. But there's been other cases where the chief executive would call out an executive ordinance power, executive order, to protect or to call out, and calling out the National Guard. The president, though, under this delegates a lot of his power, so he gives a lot of this power to the federal police agencies such as the FBI and other administrations to help to see that the laws of the national government are faithfully executed. So that's that ordinance power. So let's go on to number 2. So first of all, the chief executive has executive power, right? Number 2 has the power to seek advice of his cabinet. So he has certain heads of the state that are traditionally given, and each executive department head and it is a panel of advisors for the president. This is called the president's cabinet. We'll find more about that in the next section too. And some use their powers, and others keep them in advisory position, and they just advise the president. But some basically use the power in this. But the president has power to seek his cabinet. Today, cabinet members have little influence with the president like they did in the past. Today, he kind of relies on his White House staff, mostly on his White House staff, and we'll talk about that too. So it says, while some presidents have used their cabinet to help govern, most presidents have kept them in an advisory position, right? So, and today, cabinet members have little influence with the president. Instead, he relies on the White House staff. It says right there. Okay, number 3, power of the chief executive is the power to pardon. So he grants reprieves and pardons to persons convicted of federal crimes. They have to be federal crimes, let's just say that. So if they're state crimes, say that they're the state crimes, governors can pardon on state crimes. So basically the president just has the right to pardon federal crimes. So federal means national crimes, so those convicted of national crimes. State crimes go to the governor, and the governors can actually pardon in that case. So what is a reprieve? A reprieve is a postponement of a sentence. Say that someone was sentenced, after they were convicted and they were sentenced. It's where the sentence is postponed. And so the president can postpone a sentence. Also, pardon. Pardon is a legal exoneration for a crime after the convicted in court. So basically saying, okay, I pardon you, you're going to be free. You're not going to jail. The most famous of these pardons, of course, of presidents is President Gerald Ford in 1974, when he pardoned President Nixon, who was would have been impeached but resigned from presidency from his crimes, the crimes that were political crimes known as the Watergate, the spying on the Democratic Party of the Watergate. And so President Ford pardoned Nixon even before he was convicted, or even before he went to court on this case. So that's one of the most famous. Most people think, oh, should he be pardoned or not? You know, so that's the biggest pardon that we know. The pardoning power. So let's talk a little bit more about the pardoning power here. The pardoning power, first of all, is the power to commute or reduce a penalty. That's one of the powers. It also is the power to shorten the sentence given, or to lower the crime's fine. So they have to pay a big fine, and to lower the fine. So they can lower the fine, they can shorten the sentence, they can reduce the penalty in that way. Also is the power to grant amnesty, or a general pardon that's issued to a group of people at that time. A famous one of these amnesties would be where President Ford and Carter granted amnesty for draft dodgers during the Vietnam War. Those draft dodgers that would be convicted of crimes of avoiding the war and not going into the war, and fleeing to like places like Canada or Mexico or wherever they fled, and coming back, that basically an amnesty was given, that they would not be blamed for their crime of draft dodging. So I also have to say the pardon and power. I have to add my little tidbit here, but Abraham Lincoln pardoned, in a way, shortening the sentence and pardoning my great-great-grandfather, Artemus A. Henneman. There was uprising, and getting into the uprising of the native nation, Mdewakanton Sioux, and the Sioux Nation in Minnesota. And so they went in and they just took them, the heads of the Indian, just saying, not even giving them a trial, and they were going to put to death over, up to like 300, of these men. And Artemus A. Henneman, my great-great-grandfather, was one of them. And Lincoln came in and lowered the sentence from death sentence to a pardon. In that sense, they still went to prison, but then in the length of time there, that was also pardoned. So he was given that pardon. He became a preacher of the gospel. Got saved in prison. Missionaries, gave the gospel as they were brought to prison. It was like they didn't know which was during the times of the uprising, and they didn't know who did what or what, but they just basically wanted to put them all to death. And Lincoln stood up for the Sioux, for the Dakota Sioux at that time. But anyway, that's just a little addition, but pardoning power is very important for the President of the United States. Also, as we get here, the pardoning power. So let's go on to the next, which talks about the power of appointment. So this is a big power of the president. So the power of appointment, appointing what? To commission officers of the United States is important. So they can appoint officers of United States military and officers for various duties in the federal government. The Constitution gives a broad power to appoint officers. Only offices otherwise provided for. The Vice President is already provided for. The presidential electors are already provided for by Constitution, and the members of the House and the Senate, the senators, they're already provided for by the Constitution. But the government can appoint others, and this is, includes quite a lot of different people, So, so it's very limited. The Constitution is very limited for those that are picked by the Constitution in itself. And the president now, he can pick his staff, which is in the White House, and but most of these appointments are under the Senate too. The Senate has to give consent. So like the president can pick out ambassadors, foreign diplomats, members of the cabinet, chief assistants, federal judges. All these are important, especially federal judges, U.S. attorneys, U.S. marshals, United States marshals, heads of independent government agencies. These all can be appointed by the President of the United States. That's a big job. And with consent, of course, of the Senate. So the President has power to make temporary appointments even with the Senate, without Senate approval. So he can make a temporary appointment and say, okay, this is temporary, and the Senate doesn't need to approve it. When the Senate's not in session, the Senate can't approve it yet, so he just makes it temporary until the Senate gets back into session. So the federal appointee involves, like with a specific state, like a federal district judge, is also given what's called senatorial courtesy. So if, in this case, let's go on here, let's see, let's go down and see if it talks more about senatorial courtesy here. So it says, in considering the nomination of a federal appointee whose position will involve service in one particular state, such as a federal district judge, the Senate usually follows the custom of senatorial courtesy. So if the president picks someone from a certain state, and that senator of that state does not approve, then the Senate will stand against the president, and the president will not get that person's appointment. You know, they will stand behind the senator instead of behind the president. So that's senatorial courtesy, just to know what it is. So the appointments to the Supreme Court here, as we have a picture of here as an appointment, are the most important. I mean, everyone gets out and just watches as our appointments of the Supreme Court, because they are appointed for life. So, in fact, some examples, and they give here in your book. In 1987, President Reagan's appointment was Robert Bork to the Supreme Court, and the Civil Liberties Group and the People for the American Way lobbied to defeat him. They were really upset that he would be picked, and so there was the Senate Judicial Committee were actually trying to be persuaded by certain interest groups, and that happens a lot when there's picking a court judge, especially a Supreme Court judge. So another example was President George Bush, and his picture here is of Clarence Thomas, and he had to endure a lengthy confirmation trial before the Senate approved his appointment. So that was so anyway, I don't know why this is coming through here. I guess I have a phone call, but let's talk about that really quick, and then I'll go on to the next power that he has. But the Supreme Court, let's go ahead and stop there, and I'll start with Clarence Johnson, since I have a call coming in here, I guess. So.